So welcome everybody. My name is Murray Brown. I'm the co-founder of Wading Herons, and this is the last Wading Herons Conversation we'll be doing for 2021. It's lovely to have you, and I will be hosting today along with this fabulous group of people to have a conversation shortly on the subject of COP26 and COVID lessons, which I'll bring up there. And it's a unique moment to radically reimagine business, and I guess it could have had a question mark or a full stop at the end of that statement, but I'll leave it to you to decide which is appropriate. I should point out that if you're hoping for an analysis of COP26, a detailed look at hybrid working strategies, etc., for around COVID, this is probably not the right conversation. You might be a little bit disappointed. We're really interested in referencing that these seismic shifts that are in front of us today and seeing them as lightning rods to much deeper, more systemic business change, and dare I suggest more human and more authentic change as well. But with me today, we have Charles Wookey, the co-founder and CEO of Blueprint for Better Business, based here in the UK. We've got Nadia Woodhouse, who's a strategist at EY's Global Centre for Board Matters. Hi, Nadia, welcome. Hi, Charles, welcome. And finally, we have Janie, the author of The Listening Shift, and a leadership communications expert, and one of my favourite books from this year, Janie, as well, as you know. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll get straight into the conversation if that's right. And I might start with Charles. Charles, you've been involved in with a very good inside lens into responsible, purposeful business for well over a decade. And I'm really interested to hear what you think is different now. Is this a moment of truly systemic change, or is this something of an apparition?
Well, thank you, Murray, and it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks very much for having me along. And it's very interesting speaking to a group with those answers to the question that you raised in terms of present feeling and mood. And I just think it reflects the fact that it's been a tough year for everybody, and the kind of world we have now with continuing uncertainty is what comes next. Heaviness was the word that struck me that somebody used, and I think that's that kind of rings true for me. So I run a charity that is involved in helping organizations to become purpose-led. And we did start after the financial crisis, so I have been in this game a little while. And as I think of it at a high level, when we started, the presenting issue was trust. That's what people were worried about then. And the question I would be asked was why? So tell me why we should be interested in purpose. What's the business case? And that went on for a number of years. And there has been, I think, an extraordinary shift in the last 3 years, I would say, from 2018 onwards. And I think COVID has accelerated that shift. And the presenting issue now, I think, is system change. I think a lot of business leaders, large companies, are aware of the shifting sands beneath their feet on which their success long-term depends, both about environmental degradation and climate change, and also about social inequality, Black Lives Matter, the context in which these businesses are trying to run and be successful. So system change is I think, the deepest question. And the questions we are asked now are not why. People tend to say, yeah, I get it, purpose is important. So 2 issues. One, how do you do this well? And secondly, how do you know? How do you assess progress that you're making? Now, I think the knowledge, if you like, or understanding of what becoming a purpose-led business means has not gone anything like as deep as the change of language. So I think we've got lots of new narratives and lots of new wallpaper. And we've got some very good things that are really putting pressure on the system. Investors are putting pressure. The regulators are actually being quite helpful. Lots of people within organizations and outside them saying, why should I come and work for you? Tell me how the world is a better place as a result of that. There's bad evidence, but there's also some good evidence around purpose and being purpose-led aligned to long-term success. And I think the spotlight of the media is also an important forensic test of what companies are actually doing. So all of these, I think, are pushing large businesses to really think hard about what they say And as I would characterize it now, I mean, I work with a subset of companies who take this stuff seriously, so I'm wary of generalizing, but I think there really is something going on here. I think there's in Europe, and I think the States is a bit behind, but there is a desire to escape from the narrow ideas that Milton Friedman gave us all, and which have dominated the way business thinks about itself and its purpose is simply being to maximize shareholder value. I do think we're trying to escape that. And I think we're at the early days, as I would characterize it. I think there's great work going on around strategy and aligning to purpose and outcomes. The much harder bit, though, is people, as how organizations see themselves as human systems, which basically, and our starting point at Blueprint was always that actually, along with the idea that businesses, there's been this disconnect, there's also been people living divided lives and being miserable at work, not feeling fulfilled because they don't feel the business basically cares about people. And that is, if we're going to have purpose-led businesses in the longer term, that is the really important shift. It's human-centered organizations that see themselves as giving people the opportunity to grow and develop as people and find fulfillment through their work. And there are some great examples, but we've got loads to do. And it's much harder because it's all about behavior change and what we really care about.
Thanks, Charles. Nadia, maybe I can bring you in on this point. It's interesting to hear your perspective from the board level, because a lot of what Charles has just referred to, especially the pressures all around, must be something that the boards are feeling. But what's your sense from your research and your feedback from board members? Is net zero and COVID change front and center, dominating the agenda?
Yeah, and no, I completely agree with a lot of Charles has said, and I think that some really great examples got there. But in general terms, I mean, we interview, do a lot of research with large global organizations and the boards of those. I think, and we looked at, specifically in the lens of board risk, we looked at, how boards are looking at climate risk from 2019 to 2021. So pretty much bookending the kind of the pandemic at the start into where we are now. And I was struck by what was said at the start of the session, that there is some optimism around, how business can have a strong and lasting impact. But I think there's no sense of urgency level yet. In 2019, they didn't rank climate risk as being an issue. In 2021, so just recently, the start of this year, it ranked 9th. So it's improving, but I don't think it's improving as fast as it would be. I think the COVID recovery has shown how we are so, we can be so influenced by geopolitical risk, by supply chain disruption. I think the leaders in the board space are understanding how these risks are interconnected and how climate risk is interconnected with all of these issues. But I don't think it's, I think it could be moving faster, to be honest. And I think as well, what boards are telling us is that the burden on the board space is becoming heavier and heavier, getting a much more complex world, many more issues that they have to deal with. They spend a lot of time on risk and compliance and traditional risk, but they're not spending enough time on kind of these emerging issues, climate risk. And I think one of the ways that they can be helped is through technology, for sure, through artificial intelligence, by helping them to uncover sort of unique insights and things. And by spending a lot more time on these kind of strategic risks. Charles, what you said about people is massive. I think if we're going to get to net zero transition, you can have all of the great targets in the world, but if you're not, one, accountable and transparent, and two, if you have the right culture embedded across the organization to make that shift, then I think we're not going anywhere. So that the alignment between culture and strategy, I think, is one of our biggest issues that we need to deal with from the board space. And it comes, and it's sort of shown at the top, right? These are our strategic decision makers. They need to be leading from the front as well.
It's interesting how prevalent culture and human centricity, I guess, has featured in your answers, and probably good point to bring Janie in. Communications, certainly my experience with business communications has been much more about influencing others and conveying messaging and trying to achieve desired outcomes. But I wonder, from your very knowledgeable perspective, how what's missing in business communications, and what's 21st century business communications really calling out for?
Well, thanks, Murray. It's absolutely brilliant to hear Charles and Nadia advocate for the kind of human-centered systemic change, because I think you're right. I think we've had 20 years probably, or certainly in my experience of working over the last 20 years, most of organizational communication focus is on broadcast. It's how do I get other people to do what I want them to do, and how do I make myself look great in front of others, and how do I articulate my messages with such power and authority. And actually, I think we need to very quickly flip that on its head. Of course, I'm going to advocate for listening, but I think the big problems are the ones that Charles and Nadia have highlighted so beautifully, is that we are massively seduced by these enormous global issues. We all want to secure net zero. We all want to master the positive benefits that COVID might bring in advances in technology, etc. But actually, that's a big distraction if you're not also concentrating on every conversation that you have, because the only way we're going to change is one conversation at a time. And I think it's not sexy. Do you know, it is much more sexy to think about how do we get people to totally change the way that they interact with the planet. I mean, that's a great, noble and important focus, but that might stop me engaging really effectively in the next 3 conversations that I've got to have this morning. And actually, I think with all this stuff going on, the big word that I'm noticing, and it popped up on your Mentimeter, is agitated. You know, there's so much knowledge, so much opportunity, so much possibility, so much going on. We're all so exhausted. And that makes presence in a conversation and really probing, interrogating, understanding, inquiring, makes that very, very difficult. So I think we've some challenges ahead in bringing our focus back to the here and now, and almost staying local with that as well.
I wonder if, following on from that, I love the way you just described the sexiness or unsexiness of different aspects of communication, and I get the impression that listening is maybe traditionally has not been particularly sexy, and now it's starting to become. But why do you think listening is so challenging in a business context, Janie? I'll start with you, Janie, maybe.
I think we all want to be right. You know, we all want to bring the transformational idea, and the more pressure that we're under, the more certainty we feel under pressure to convey. So in meetings, in presentations, in all our communication, we've got to sound like we know what we're talking about and we know what we're doing. And so listening is exhausting, because that might challenge my worldview, or it might mean that everything I've just spent the last 2 months doing is actually a waste of time, or it's just very difficult to be still enough to listen well. And it's hard work. And this, you very generously referred to my book, but one of the reasons it's called The Listening Shift is actually, I think it's quite helpful to listen in shifts. I can't do it all the time. So when I can do it, I can really be still and really focus and really try to understand. But if we all try and do everything all the time, we're not going to do anything any of the time.
Charles, you want to?
No, I love what you've just been saying, Janie, and what strikes me is, these businesses are adaptive, complex systems. We don't have linear solutions, and we are living in uncertainty, increasing uncertainty. And it follows that the best way to operate is collaboratively, because none of us has all the answers. And this desire for control and to project a sense of false certainty is, I think, a real issue. And I love what you're saying. And in our work, we talk about the importance of dialogue and trying to move away from the idea of doing things to and for people, to with and alongside them. And what are the conditions in which you can genuinely create space for that to happen? And there's a kind of letting go of power and a recognition that actually what we can create together each of us, if we do it really well, can create something that none of us can create on our own. Therefore, the importance of diversity and inclusion to getting better answers to these complex issues where different points of view are really, really important to bring in. I've just been reading about Mary Parker Follett, who's absolutely fascinating 1920s American thinker, who developed, and she became very well known. She then died just after the crash and then was taken over by Taylorism, and so she went into history completely unremarked. But her thinking is absolutely brilliant, and it's about the importance of co-creation and integration as ways in which we can all participate in creating solutions through dialogue and through listening.
I'm going to go to Nadia in a second and just to pick up on the point of diversity. But before I do it, I should mention, if anybody is listening and has a burning question or comment they'd like to make, please enter anything you've got in the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye on that and try and incorporate that in the conversation. So yeah, Nadia, this point of diversity, which for many years, diversity has been a topic in the business world, and depending on your perspective, is used well, and others it's used really as a tick box exercise. What do you think? Maybe starting at the board level, what do you think is being done, or maybe not being done, around the question of diversity, and really benefiting from this enormous opportunity of diverse thinking and diverse perspectives?
Yeah, I like what you said there, Murray, around diverse thinking and perspectives, because I think too often our brains go to diversity being gender and race, and it is that, but it's so much more than that. It's around the soft skills as well. It's around different ways of making decisions. I think obviously around race, I mean, there's some really, clear stats, like in the US, there's going to be the majority of people are going to be people of color by sort of 2035, 2040. And if you don't have a board that represents your customers, it's not going to make those decisions that are going to benefit them. And we need to start thinking about, our stakeholders as well. So that's incredibly important. But in terms of diversity of thought, you can also have a different looking board, but if they all went to Ivy League schools, or if they all went to the same types of schools, then they're going to be making the same decisions in the same way. So challenging that, I think, is really important. There's a really nice stat as well from some research from Bloomberg that said that if you have boards with over 30% women on them, there's many benefits to that, but they actually have more likelihood of creating climate innovations as well, based on some research. So there's it's about fresh thinking. It's about bringing in different people, and also one thing that's really important to mention, I think, is young people as well. Age, diversity in age. Going back to COP26, you've got those people holding leaders' feet to the fire. You've got to have that type of thinking, those stakeholders at the boardroom table, whether it's in a shadow council or whether we start listening, as Janie said, to different generations. I think that's incredibly important. But boards are not going to be able to pull all of this in and pull all this together. I think there's going to be a need for a bit of a shift. There's only 24 hours in a day. Boards are getting packs of information that are 800 pages long every time they go for a meeting. They are under more pressure to have more, more skill sets, more committees, more. It's sort of like, when is enough? And as we all saw before, everyone is tired and agitated, and there's just so much information. So it's interesting to see, is the system going to break after a while? How much input can one board take? Question I've been thinking about for a while.
And Janie, when you speak to leaders and coaching them around communications and starting to open their ears up around listening, what do you think is the situation with this concept of more diverse thinking and more diverse perspectives? Are their ears opening up to these different perspectives, or is it still a challenging time?
I think the spirit is willing. Do you know what? I think that we all, or certainly the people that I'm working with, recognize the value of that 100%. I think some of the populations included in diverse thinking are more challenging. For example, Nadia, I personally think, God, how fantastic to have young people on boards. I think it's absolutely wonderful. There's still a little bit of resistance in that sort of I'm the experienced one here, you don't know what I know, that kind of thing. I think there is an absolute mental willingness. I think paying attention to that and reflecting on our own behavior and challenging ourselves to embrace different thinking, I think in the moment that can probably be unseated. So there's a tension there between I want to do it, but I'm not going to do it with them, all right? I forgot to do it then, or you know, it's perfectly understandable because, like Nadia said, you know, we got an 800-page document to absorb, and you're supposed to be behaviorally brilliant, and you're supposed to accept everybody in every way. You know, this is a really difficult time for us all, and I noticed the assertion popping up everywhere, you know, be kind. Feels like I'm being stabbed with it.
It's not an invitation.
It's like, don't be kind. Yeah, it's just as even as I'm talking about that, I think I have huge empathy for all of us because it is so difficult. We are in a really difficult place of change. Yeah. But you've got to say chaos is the only way to really upend the system, isn't it? It's only when something's really painful that we probably might find an urgent route out.
Yeah, so Charles, a comment that you made earlier about seeing organizations as human systems and putting people at the center of this. Maybe we can use this to just shift into some of our own practical experiences where we've seen things tried, tested, things that have worked or failed. But where would you say, where have you seen trying to put people at the center of the strategic intent or in the conversations around positive business working?
Well, let me give you one example, which just one of the large companies we're working with, which had done a whole bunch of work on purpose before the pandemic, but just before the pandemic, then found itself in a way accelerating its thinking and having to innovate because everybody's suddenly working, or most people working remotely. A lot of managers very busy not doing what they were doing before. So people kind of left to their own devices. And they did a really good thing, which was to get a learning group to become very curious about what had happened over the months when that situation was there and how different patterns of working had emerged. So there were kind of limiting patterns that emerged when people started to micromanage out of fear of remoteness. And then there were liberating patterns that emerged when the opposite happened, where essentially people were trusted more than they had been before to get on with whatever it was that they were doing. And surprise, surprise, where people are actually given a degree of autonomy and trust and resources, things start to blossom. So what I found very interesting was the way the organization began to try and understand the change that had taken place and what was going on and what was bringing out, both in using this idea of patterns as a way of trying to understand the relationships between how behavior change was taking place and the relationship between teams and managers. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this kind of shift. And I don't think in complex systems there are easy strategic or cultural levers you just pull and you suddenly, out of kind of like a sausage machine, you get perfectly functioning human beings at the end of it. You know, we're dealing with systems. And so I think a stance of curiosity and experimentation is a really powerful thing, and listening and also recognizing that some things are going to fail, and that's okay. Yeah. And I think the tolerance within organizations to give people permission to try new stuff and to recognize that actually we need to create completely different patterns of working and a willingness to experiment, which is difficult for incumbents that have grown up and have got these deep set reflexes. And one of my worries is that when you have lots of innovation through COVID, then we come out of it, the elastic band springs back and everybody says, okay, well, that was all right. We had to do that during the pandemic. So let's now go back to business as usual. And I think that would be a tremendous shame, because I think there's some very, very good, innovative, human-based instincts, including around serving customers and supply chains. It's not just employees. I think it's amazing, actually, how many businesses really have thought of themselves in terms of the quality of relationships, not just transactions that they want to sustain, on which their success depends. So I do think there is good stuff. I mean, one can overstate it, and obviously there are lots of businesses that haven't done any of this, so I don't want to romanticize it. But I do think that there is a real way in which business have been able to demonstrate through the pandemic, actually particularly, a way of putting people first, which is new, in a sense, or a return to something pre-Friedman.
I really like that idea of sort of innovation where trust is the central principle of innovation. So, and it's fascinating to see the different ways that companies have tried to, well, they've kind of had to trust, right? They haven't had a lot of choice. So, and they've used different ways of applying that. But innovation, where you have a deep sense of trust of your people, is demonstrably different to the where it's highly controlled. But I wonder, Nadia, maybe just flipping back a little bit to some of the challenges at board level in particular. Corporate governance is such a critical enabler for change, but it's also potentially a real blocker. So do you feel that there's trust coming out of the boardroom, or is it still quite a challenge?
I mean, I think from a civil society perspective that, we've lost a bit of trust in perhaps government, but we're looking to business to solve some of the issues. You look at things like the B Corp movement, for example, you see organizations kind of corralling together to solve some of society's great challenges. You see some of the leaders around, but I do wonder, I think it's organization by organization. I mean, Charles, you made a great point. From my personal experience working at EY, we moved to flexible working long before the pandemic. And so it was an easy cultural shift. It was an easy shift to make. And we were, there was a sense of trust there. But when you're working in an organization that is, sort of focused on face-to-face interaction, or, that hasn't had the chance to work at home, that's gonna be an issue. And I think if the board isn't focused on instilling that level of trust and instilling the processes and encouraging management and empowering management to make those decisions, then I think it's probably all going to fall down. There's that delineation that still needs to be there between the board and management, but the board are very visible these days, right? Much more than they ever have been. I think with social media, you get people being called out and all this sort of thing. So they also need to make, to live by example. So I think it really depends on the culture of the company.
What are some of the attributes that you see of leaderboards, I guess, or the boards that are really ahead of the game here and leading from the front? What are they doing differently?
I think, for one, they're looking, and this is to Charles's point, they're looking at things in a systemic way. They're not looking at risk in a siloed, way. They're trying to figure out, well, what if I pull this lever, what's going to happen here? I think leading boards are spending the right amount of time on strategy and culture. I think, I guess leading boards are a little bit more diverse. And to Janie's point, I think they listen a bit more. We're seeing a bit of a transition, or hopefully a huge transition, to long-term value creation and stakeholder-led capitalism. So trying to figure out, well, who are our stakeholders and what do they need? And I do think that boards are under a lot of pressure. I actually do feel for them, because it's very litigious, especially here in Australia, for example. It's they don't have a lot of time, as I mentioned. They get a lot of information, and the extrinsic value of being a board member is kind of diminished now. And you've really got to figure out, well, what's in it for me intrinsically, what's my purpose, and how am I going to contribute to sort of improving the social fabric and understanding the social contract. So those boards are having those more in-depth conversations. I think I don't sit at those boards, and I don't sit in on conversations, so I don't know, but that's the sense that I get, that leading boards and leading board members really understand kind of what their value to society is, and sort of what the broader purpose is, rather than tick the box and shareholder value, even though I've got to say that that's still such a big pressure, short-term earnings. So this is something to be shifted there for sure.
And in the Janie, in the rush for solutions around net zero or COVID responses or whatever the big topic is. Generally, it's quite typical of business to really run to analysis and executing and implementing solutions. There's a danger there that we miss the bigger picture and opportunities as well for some of this. How are you experiencing people that you work with reacting to this dilemma of racing to solve problems, but also recognizing that taking a step back, observing what's going on around them, listening more, and altering the way they communicate? How's your experience in that space?
Such a great question, actually, because of course there are pockets of everything. As you've asked that question, and I was thinking, listening to what both Nadia and Charles were saying, I suddenly had a flash of a poster that I saw in a service station once, and it was an advert for Garmin, and it just boldly said, "You're not stuck in traffic. You are traffic." Which, personally, I thought, my God, how rude, because I'm always saying, why doesn't everyone else go home so that I can, obviously we're not really stuck in traffic anymore because everyone is at home. But it's the individual accountability, the individual, people, we're talking about culture change, but actually it's getting everyone to recognize they are culture. If you're not talking about your culture objectively, if you're on a board, you're not talking about your culture objectively. If you're one of the team, across the organization, you are it. And so I think that where those pockets are, I'm really encouraging the people I work with to just take that step by step, minute by minute accountability in shifts, because it's exhausting. But I think there's something about, do you remember the old Stephen Covey thing when he used to talk about circles of influence and circles of concern, which was such a simple idea, but actually it's just trying to get people to think about what they can do in the moment with an eye on the big picture, and that I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's very pressing for me, just hearing what everyone has been saying there.
I love the Garmin. It's a really good one. It's very hard to see it's very hard to see the wood when you're one of the trees, and I guess that's the point. And if you're trying to change culture or trying to influence culture, and you don't see yourself as part of it, and recognize that you've got a role.
Well, we're all talking about culture change, but actually we are part of that, and it just feels like every decision, every micro decision we make, every micro interaction we have, it's going to be very tiring, but that's going to make the big shifts, because it'll just be those incremental micro adjustments.
I wonder if we could come back to it's probably a combination of some of the new or emerging risks and possibly resulting from these various pressures. A lot of companies these days, or most companies these days, have pressures coming from all sides. It used to be, they could handle a lot of external pressures through, whether it's regulation or crisis. They could use PR type avenues to solve them or to deal with them. That's no longer the case. And I just wonder, with some of the emerging risks that we're seeing, either in a business executive level or a board level, how is that changing the nature of the problems we're trying to solve and things we're trying to address here? Because it doesn't feel as easy as it was to just sort of compartmentalize measurable risks, and now we're talking about quite different types of risks. So I don't know if, Nadia, you have some first thoughts on that, and we can.
Yeah, I reckon Charles probably got some thoughts too, and Janie. But I do think that the emerging risks are things that boards have not dealt with before. We've had hundreds of years of sort of business as we know it, and management systems and processes are shifting and evolving. But I think the board structure itself is a risk, because boards haven't changed. The way that they operate and governance models actually haven't changed. And there's so much for them to deal with that they kind of, I guess, they stop to kind of turn around and look at what's going on inside and how they make decisions and how it works. So that I think that's one thing. I think, you know, we've talked about culture constantly, and that we are culture. I think the idea that risks are interdependent and interconnected is really, really important, and figuring that out. I think boards are now more looking outwards. The leaders that we speak to say that they bring in more and more experts at every board meeting, you know, trying to figure out, well, what does a science-based target look like for us, or what is, you know, particularly cybersecurity. That was the biggest thing over the last few years, and it only got exacerbated with COVID and everybody working from home. So these being able to respond quite quickly to risks that come up, and then still having your eye on the prize, and, you know, what is our greater purpose and how does our strategy support that purpose? That's a really big tension that I think requires a lot of conversation. It's more complex than ever. I think I've quite a lot of sympathy.
Charles, I'll let you comment on that.
Well, I completely agree with Nadia. I think that boards, my sense is that there is this kind of cycle of, well, it's just a growth of pressure and a sense of so many agendas that you have to deal with. It gets harder. I think conceptually there's a really important shift with boards, which I think some are going through now, which is that if you buy the thesis that the purpose of a business is to benefit society, and making money is an outcome and a condition of doing that well, the job of the board changes fundamentally. So in the Milton Friedman view of the world, the job of the board is to solve the agency problem, i.e. to make sure the managers do what the shareholders want. And by and large, that's the construct which we're trying to escape from. And as Nadia says, the kind of current model of governance is kind of set up to achieve that aim. And in a way, it seems to me that the purpose agenda moves the job of the board in a radically different direction. And the job of the board becomes the collective trustees of the purpose. So they then are more broadly accountable to the communities and the stakeholders on which the success of the business depends. And they should, in that sense, be creating the freedom and the challenge to management to operate according and true to the organization's purpose, with the clarity that that brings, with the alignment of strategy, and thinking hard about the evolution of a culture that will enable that to be successfully pursued over time. I think one of the things, the stresses there, though, is, and people who critique this view would say this, well, yeah, but you're now saying accountability, you're accountable to everyone. And if you're accountable to everyone, you're accountable to no one. And these businesses are now being expected to solve all the problems that government should have been solving. And I think we have to be there's some good challenge there. And I think in the rhetoric around organizational purpose, we do have to be clear about the limits of what a business exists to do in the world. And I worry about some of the rhetoric which says, well, business will solve not only climate change, but social inequality and a bunch of other things. Well, they won't, and they can't. And actually what we need is better government and better regulation and active citizens working to produce societies together that collectively address these issues. So, and not lay the whole responsibility on business, because I don't think business can do it. But the one thing I would say that and this goes to the risk question as well, I do think, and I've seen this, that really imaginative, powerfully driven business leaders and boards who understand the systemic problems that they're part of use their agency for collective action. So they say, okay, we can't solve this problem by ourselves, but we are moving away from a world in which we'll just pay PR people to lobby on our behalf and to persuade people not to get on our backs, but we will do the opposite of that, which will be honest and transparent about the issues and work with other people to try and address them, because our purpose pushes us to a stance and a mentality of collaboration. And that, I think, is very exciting.
Mm. And what is, Charles, just maybe just taking that a little bit further, what are some of the outcomes that you've seen of that type of stance, where they've been more activist, more engaged with
well, I mean, I think of one company that we did a bit of work with in 2017 when they were 100, which is Anglo-American. And they have, I think, difficult industry, mining, but as a responsible miner, they recognize that the countries and the communities in which they operate, it needs to be mutual. In other words, they need a situation in which long-term, the communities in which they put a mine in 60 years' time say to themselves, I'm glad these people came. because they've genuinely created value for the community, which lasts long after the mine has gone. And that mentality, I do think, under Mark Cutifani's leadership of that company, they had it before, has been really powerful. And it's exemplified during COVID, where they produced this thing called We Care in South Africa and used their agency in the system to work with other companies. They brought other companies in and the government to help produce national solutions and to address the COVID issue in a way that used, they didn't have to do that as a business. Why did they do it? Because it came straight from their sense of being purpose-led. And I think that's a great example of a big company using its agency to broader good.
Yeah, it's something I definitely see evidence of that more and more. Hi, Janie, hi.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by what you were just saying there, Charles. And I'm interested in, it sounds like a company like Anglo American really connect to their purpose and really get it. And I suppose what my question is, I'm nervous that purpose has become as much of a buzzword as vision used to be and all that stuff. And do you have any thoughts or recommendations of how companies can best get under the skin of their purpose, how they can really find it so that they can connect in the way that Anglo Americans sound like they have, which is so amazing?
Yeah, well, we do, and that's a lot of what we spend our time on as the charity at Blueprint. And the first thing we often do is to stop companies doing whatever they were doing, because usually it's an action orientated, very quick response, comms led, and we just say, well, so what are you trying to achieve? And what will be different about the world as a result of this purpose exercise? And get curious with them about, well, what do you really want? What could be really brilliant about this business, and what's getting in the way of that? And a conversation about the why is at some point becomes very, very powerful and relevant, but it isn't necessarily where you start. And I think creating a shared understanding and creating the time, and to your point, Ginny, about listening, to discern what people have a shared understanding about, to challenge that, about what could be different. That's very, very important, because you can sometimes have a situation where you have a strong leader who comes in, who may be very passionate, and then everybody will just go along with it because they're the leader. But then you just get purpose compliance, which is hopeless, because people, if they don't really believe it, they don't really believe it'll make a better business, better for society, it's not going to work. So I think there's a huge amount of effort that goes in before any words are crafted, in terms of thinking and debating and having a real ambition for what the business could be, given the issues of the world and what role they could play and the urgency of those issues.
So I wonder if I could ask you guys just to switch to some more sort of practical, pragmatic pieces of advice or suggestions, things you've either seen or tried, or you would really advocate that people might want to do, especially if they're trying to be a little bit more provocative, a little bit more, maybe a bit more radical in their thinking. They may have some stuck, some permafrost in their organization they need to try and thaw out. So maybe we could start with you, Nadia, of some thoughts that you'd like to share there.
Yeah. I think I mentioned a few things, but definitely looking within, and this is all from a board perspective, making sure that your board, in the way it's structured or the way it thinks, is reflective of its customers or broader stakeholders, the people that it chooses to serve. Once you've had that conversation with Charles about who that is and why we're here. I also think that aligning, I guess, once you figure out your purpose, you've got to develop a strategy that aligns to it or supports that, and there needs to be an alignment with your culture as well, because it's all well and good having a strategy, but if you don't have the right behaviors to support that and to underpin it, then taking a good look at that is going to be really, really important. Perhaps thinking about how you spend your time as a board, and is it all on the mundane stuff and the stuff you really want to be doing? Obviously, there's stuff you have to do. You definitely have to look at financial reporting. You definitely have to do all the compliance stuff. But how could we use technology to help free up some time or to assist us? I think it's important. I really loved what Charles said about this, the collaboration approach, or Janie, I'm not sure, but it was more about kind of the ecosystem approach. You can't do this on our own. You can't expect one board or one person on one board to create the change. You've got to start influencing the customers, your clients, the people you buy from, your supply chain. We've got to be collaborative, and we've got to find leaders that work in circles to do that as well, and to create that peer network support. And I think one last thing I would say is maybe ask the bold question, is our governance model really serving us? I don't think, it's kind of an unpopular question for many, but if we're going to radically reimagine business, we need to figure out, is the current, unitary board structure, in some places, is that model going to serve us? Are we reliant on 12 people to create the change? I don't think so. So that's sort of a bonus question, perhaps, after you've done all the rest.
Janie, I'll come to you then. You always have some great tips and advice, but if there's one or two things you would encourage people to maybe try differently, or yeah.
Well, something I'm working on myself constantly is to be curious, not certain. So the minute I find myself making a decision about what someone has said, I'm currently engaged in the practice of trying to ask another question. So I would encourage everybody to try and do that. I saw curiosity came up on your Mentimeter, which is a delight. It was fabulous to see that word there. And I've heard both Charles and Nadia use it. So I think as a sort of intention, if purpose is the overriding thing, then the intention has to be to try to be curious. The second thing I would really encourage us all to do, because everyone's agitated and tired and under pressure is to monitor our interruptions, because I notice that we've become very comfortable with shutting other people down by diving in. And I think, there are two types of interruptions. There's kind of positive ones where we might be, oh, yes, I agree with you. And can I add, or can I build on that? But then there's the other one, which is, no, actually, can we talk about what I'm interested in talking about? And just as a really practical approach to developing curiosity, but also opening our minds, particularly in these diversity and inclusion conversations and approaches, is just notice how you interrupt and why, and whether you need to.
That's great. Thank you very much. So Charles, I'm going to turn to you. I also have a question I'd like to from the audience, which I'd like to just bring in, if you don't mind. I'll just try and paraphrase a little bit, but the point we were talking earlier about having a clear purpose that you strive to achieve as a company is, I think the question is getting at, is there a risk here that if it's a self-directed purpose, that you either inadvertently cause some other social or environmental issue elsewhere that you're not paying attention to? And if it's not science-based or evidence-based purpose, are we potentially causing more harm? I just wonder how, when you're advising companies, how you're helping them keep connected to the bigger picture.
Okay, so that's a really great question, actually. The way we think about it at Blueprint is, first of all, a good purpose starts from the question, how is the world a better place as a result of our being here? So are we producing goods that are truly good, services that truly serve, and what problems are people and planet are we really trying to solve? Now, and then of course, we're interconnected as part of a system, which is why at Blueprint, what we did was to develop what we call these 5 principles of a purpose-led business, which thinks not only about your purpose, which is the thing in the middle, but also, are you honest and fair with customers and suppliers? Are you a responsible and responsive employer, a good citizen, and a guardian for future generations? And our encouragement to businesses is to think about your impacts on all those you touch. And you have a responsibility as a purpose-led business for that impact to be, as far as possible, a positive one. So you should think about materiality in your relationships, and you should think about, you can't be all things to all people, but you need, if you're going to do this seriously, in our view, you need not only to have super clarity around the why and what you end up doing then, and your strategy that follows from that, but also this desire to have these positive impacts and to think about those, which of course at one level is dealing with ESG and investor risk, but is more profoundly a positive centered view of the business, of seeing the interconnection between all these things, to go back to a point Nadia was making earlier, which I think is that's the really crucial difference, I think, with this. It takes you out of silo thinking and into a deep curiosity and a desire to be super clear about the connections for the relationships on which your success depends. So that's how I mean, it's a great question, because I think there is that risk, actually.
Yeah.
You can do good stuff over here at the cost of bad, unintended stuff over there. And I think the way to try and de-risk that is to become very conscious of all the relationships on which you depend and on which you influence.
Right. I think that's a wonderful point to probably just to wind things up. And thank you very much for that. I would, so just a couple of quick notes I made in summary of the sort of more practical advice or takeaways here. I think firstly, we heard from Nadia making time in the board, making time using technology to try and create space. And yes, you have to focus on all the things that you need to do, but we've got to create these opportunities and space to think about these new and emerging risks. Janie having an intention to be more curious, using interruptions in the right way, and allowing yourself to be more open and curious to what you're hearing and maybe what you're not hearing as well. I think that's a really important tangible piece of advice. And for Charles, around purpose, I think having a clarity around your why, definitely, but also having desire and really thinking about the implications of that, the impacts of that, and the interconnectedness of some of these things. If you can't, you shouldn't be charging down a path without considering the interconnectedness of the actions. So look, I'd like to give people a few minutes back to finish off their lunch or dinner, wherever you are. But thank you very much, the three of you, for joining me, and for the audience as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And I wish everybody a wonderful end of 2021 and into next year. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much indeed.